President Trump's national emergency declaration has its first legal challenge tonight, just hours after the president declared it. The watchdog group Public Citizen filed a lawsuit in federal court in Washington challenging the president's announcement today that he will redirect billions of dollars of federal funding to build a border wall because of his so-called national emergency. Democrats in Congress are also making plans to fight the president's declaration, and our first guest tonight is a member of the Judiciary Committee, which is now planning an investigation of the emergency declaration. Even Donald Trump is having a hard time pretending that this is an actual emergency. For one thing, he flew to Mar-a-Lago right after declaring the national emergency. And look at how he started his big speech, issuing the national emergency declaration. Notice what he doesn't mention.
Before we begin, I'd like to just say that we have a large team of very talented people in China. We've had a negotiation going on for about 2 days. It's going extremely well. Who knows what that means? You know all of the situation with respect to Brexit. We have a very good trading relationship with UK. We have a lot of great announcements having to do with Syria. We're working on a summit, and you know all about the summit. It'll be in Vietnam, Hanoi. We've been working very closely with South Korea, with Japan. But China, Russia on the border have really been at least partially living up to what they're supposed to be doing.
If there is a real emergency at the southern border, you'd think Trump might have started his announcement by actually talking about it. Instead, the first border he mentioned was the one in North Korea. When he finally talked about the U.S. border, he announced his national emergency and made this strange prediction.
We will have a national emergency, and we will then be sued, and they will sue us in the Ninth Circuit, even though it shouldn't be there, and we will possibly get a bad ruling, and then we'll get another bad ruling, and then we'll end up in the Supreme Court, and hopefully we'll get a fair shake, and we'll win in the Supreme Court.
Today, the ACLU and the state of California said they also plan to challenge the president in court. If the president is hoping to win those court battles, his administration will probably need a better explanation for ignoring Congress to build the wall than the one that he gave to NBC's Peter Alexander.
In the past, when President Obama tried to use executive action as it related to immigration, you said the whole concept of executive order, it's not the way the country's supposed to be run. You said you're supposed to go through Congress and make a deal. Will you concede that you were unable to make the deal that you had promised in the past, and that the deal you're ending up with now from Congress is less than what you could have had before a 35-day shutdown?
I went through Congress. I made a deal, but I want to do it faster. I could do the wall over a longer period of time. I didn't need to do this, but I'd rather do it much faster.
I didn't need to do this, said the president, who is ultimately going to have to justify why he declared a national emergency. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi responded to that with this tweet. Clearest sign that real Donald Trump's fake Trump emergency is not legitimate? The president himself says he didn't need to declare a national emergency. It's just a faster way to force taxpayers to foot the bill after Congress wouldn't let him have his way. Another strange moment today was when the president explicitly tied his so-called national emergency to the 2020 election.
And I don't have to do it for the election. I've already done a lot of wall for the election, 2020. And the only reason we're up here talking about this is because of the election. Because they want to try and win an election, which it looks like they're not going to be able to do.
I don't know what I've already done a lot of wall actually means, but just to be clear, not a single mile of new wall construction has happened. Trump also had a lot to say about conservative talk radio hosts, including Ann Coulter, who called him an idiot today. And today, House Democrats responded to the president. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Joaquin Castro said they will introduce a resolution to terminate the emergency declaration. And the House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler sent a letter to the president saying his committee, quote, is commencing an immediate investigation into this matter, which raises both serious constitutional and statutory issues. We ask that you make those individuals involved in this declaration available to us for a hearing in the coming days. All right, joining us now is Democratic Congressman David Cicilline of Rhode Island. He is on the Judiciary Committee, and he's the chair of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, and he has visited the U.S.-Mexico border multiple times. Congressman, good to see you. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Good to see you. My pleasure.
The president was having trouble making a clear justification for why he declared this national emergency. He did mention Ann Coulter, he mentioned Rush Limbaugh, he mentioned Sean Hannity, but in the end, he may be diverting funds that would otherwise be used for legitimate military purposes. I want to just play for you quickly what Donald Trump said about why he would do that.
We had certain funds that are being used at the discretion of generals, at the discretion of the military. Some of them haven't been allocated yet, and some of the generals think that this is more important. I was speaking to a couple of them. They think this is far more important than what they were going to use it for. I said, what were you going to use it for? And I won't go into details, but it didn't sound too important to me.
Congressman, that's just weird. You've been down to the border. I haven't spoken to any generals who have suggested that the things that they're doing with their money would be less useful, than spending it on a border wall. But this is F-35 training. This is real construction work at bases. This is kind of hard to believe what the president just said.
Yeah, I mean, the president is suggesting he's going to take money from critical military construction and counter-narcotics work. I mean, it's kind of ironic when he's claiming he needs to build a wall for both those purposes. But look, there is no emergency at the border. I've been there 2 times in the last year. The border crossings, illegal border crossings, are down to a 40-year low. His own intelligence community, when they do the world threat assessment that identifies the greatest threats to the United States, didn't even reference the southern border and certainly never said there was an emergency. So there is no emergency at the border. And the president's statutory authorization that he's referring to relates to military construction to support the armed forces, which is clearly not immigration related. So there's no basis for this. This is the president attempting to circumvent the will of the American people as reflected through decisions in Congress. This is really disrespectful to the rule of law, to the separation of powers between the branches of government. And we have a democracy. The president, just because he's frustrated that he didn't get what he wants, isn't allowed to just circumvent the democratic process. He's not an imperial king where he can just issue an edict. We have a functioning democracy, and he failed to convince the Congress and the American people of the necessity of this wall, and he just can't do what he's purporting or proposing to do.
The president's trying to get $8 billion for this. This is more than the $5.7 billion he was asking for in the first place. But the 5.7, as we know, was a red herring to start with, because even the most conservative estimates about the wall that the president wants to build was in the 20 to 25. There are estimates that are close to double that. But at that point, you as representatives have to deal with the fact that $8 billion is a lot of money. $8 billion for technology that is not deemed by the experts to say the thing that is going to keep our border more secure is a waste of American money. And as Nancy Pelosi said, this is one way or the other taxpayer money.
No, absolutely. Look, we have a responsibility to make certain that we secure the border in this country, but we need to do it in a way that actually achieves the objective, using the best technology, doing cargo inspections, using drones, using satellites, additional personnel, the things that the experts say will actually work, rather than this sort of monument to the Trump campaign promise that I remind your viewers he said that Mexico was going to pay for. It's ineffective. It's wasteful. It will not achieve the objective he claims it will. And that's why a bipartisan group of Congress negotiated a resolution of this issue and passed it overwhelmingly, because we settled on smart, tough, effective border security and not this campaign promise that the president made.
Congressman, the chairman of your committee, Jerry Nadler, has sent this letter to the president saying, make people who are involved in this decision available because you're going to investigate. On what basis are you going to investigate? What are you looking for?
Well, we're looking for the president to come forward and the president's team to make clear what is the basis of this determination. How do they come to the conclusion that there was a national emergency, which, of course, there is not? What advice he got with respect to whether or not that was appropriate? What authority he thinks he has to reallocate funds? We want to understand kind of how the president came to this decision, what influenced his ultimate decision to do this, because what we really believe is this part, as he mentioned in the press conference, this is about a campaign. This is about keeping this issue alive so that he can claim he's fighting to secure the border and nobody else will do it and no one else wants to get it done but him. And he's going to continue with this narrative. He wants this fight because he thinks it's politically advantageous. But it's dangerous to allow the president of the United States to circumvent the will of Congress, the rule of law in this country, the separation of powers, and just decide that he thinks this is important, this policy disagreement, and he's going to go ahead without congressional authorization, undermines rule of law in this country, undermines our democracy, and the Judiciary Committee is going to have a full investigation of this so that we can let the American people see what's really happened here.
Congressman, thank you for joining me tonight. Congressman David Cicilline of Rhode Island. All right, let's bring in our panel. Dara Lind is a senior correspondent for Vox.com covering immigration. Christina Beltran is an associate professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University, and she's also the author of The Trouble with Unity, Latino Politics and the Creation of Identity. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for being with us. Dara, let me start with you. This was a fact-checker's dream today, the president's rambling, unscripted conversation in which he talked about kind of anything that came into his mind. But the fact is, he kept on going at journalists who were asking him fact-based questions about the truth about immigration, about the people who come across the border, about drugs. The president was creating and crafting and discussing his own reality today.
Yes, that's absolutely true. It's also not the first time we've heard this. I mean, so much of what he said today, he said during his primetime speech in January, during the State of the Union. The problem with talking about the border right now is that Donald Trump takes up so much oxygen talking about this kind of fever dream of this lawless environment that talking about the actual difficulties that there are with, unprecedented numbers of children and families coming in, whether Border Patrol is equipped to handle that, serious concerns about the conditions that people are being kept in aren't coming to the fore because it's entirely determined by Donald Trump says there is a crisis and therefore that's all anyone can talk about.
And all of the energy, you're right, it takes all the oxygen. Everybody who could be working on other things, and I think you can get 100% agreement in this country that there are issues with immigration, but to different people, those are different things. Christina, this is the problem, right? Donald Trump has, for better or worse, created a narrative around bad people coming over the southern border, and that's our immigration problem.
Right. I mean, there's actual realities. We could have really important and interesting discussions about around immigration, but instead we're sort of caught up in Donald Trump's sort of racist dystopian fever dream. And I think that a lot of it that we really, have to think about is that his base and the nativist portion of his base are really informed by that fantasy. So reality doesn't change it. So it's a constant reference. And this, I think one thing that's important to think about is that this has a long history. Since the 19th century, there have been certain characterizations of Mexicans as bestial, as savage. And so there's a kind of historical resonance here with the way he constantly takes an almost, at times even like an almost pornographic pleasure you heard today, where he describes these lurid discussions of migrant women being tied up with duct tape and being brutalized. And so there's a kind of compulsion he has to tell this story. And a lot of it it's like misogyny disguised as compassion.
Let me just play that, because I think that was in a weird thing that was even weirder when he started talking about this, because I want to get to the bottom of this one. Donald Trump was describing, as you say, human trafficking today. Let's listen together.
They can't see three women with tape in their mouth or three women whose hands are tied. They go through areas where you have no wall. Everybody knows that. Nancy knows it. Chuck knows it. They all know it.
The danger here, Christina, is that human trafficking is a really serious problem.
Right.
Lots of women get brought into this country and are trafficked. Yeah. Most of them with passports through border crossings. To suggest that that's how we're dealing with the problem of human trafficking is misleading and detrimental to our fight against human trafficking.
Yeah, it's actually completely unhelpful in every way. And it also is really tied to this idea of migrant women being brutalized because Mexican men or Latin American men are monsters, right? And so it's a constant exercise in displacement. It's always this story that we have real problems in this country. We have problems with drugs, right? We have real issues with economic inequality. But rather than have conversations conversations about the reality of economic inequality, lower wages, drug use. Instead, we have this conversation in which all of those issues are displaced onto migrants as these sort of savage criminals. And so if we have walls, then those problems will not be here.
So that's one problem. And Dara, the other problem is that it's not clear whether this is just a base or just nativist supporters of Donald Trump. Kelly O'Donnell got into a conversation with the president today about whether or not his policy is being determined by right-wing media hosts. Let's listen.
Mr. President, could you tell us to what degree some of the outside conservative voices help to shape your views on this national emergency?
I would talk about it. Look, Sean Hannity has been a terrific supporter of what I do. Rush Limbaugh, I think he's a great guy. He's a guy who can speak for 3 hours without a phone call. Try doing that sometime.
They be deciding policy, sir.
They don't decide policy. Ann Coulter, I don't know her. I hardly know her. I haven't spoken to her in way over a year. But the press loves saying Ann Coulter. I like her. But she's off the reservation. But anybody that knows her understands that.
Dara, I mean, that was just weird. The president was asked about influences, and he named the three people who most observers think he is building his immigration policy for.
Yeah, although it's always hard to know with this president whether he's saying that because he actually does have relationships with them or whether he's saying that because he watches a whole lot of television. And so if those are the names that are coming up as influencers, he's going to interpret that. But it's definitely clear that Trump is very afraid of any fight with people who he thinks of as mediating between him and his base, even to the point where, you know, he's been saying for years at this point that any border barrier that is built needs to be steel poles or steel bollards or slats. But when he, you know, posted a sketch of a design in December and the right wing freaked out to a certain extent because they were still expecting a concrete wall, he had to backtrack on that, even though that's exactly what his DHS has said they want to build. The stuff that's authorized in the funding bill that Congress just passed is identical to the stuff that they want to build with emergency money. The definition of a wall has gotten caught up in this dynamic between Trump and the right wing media because it's not clear which one of them, if there were a fight, would be the one to take the base.
And the sad part is after throwing out the line about Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and Ann Coulter responded today by saying, look, the only national emergency is that our president is an idiot. I'd hope that if I called somebody out, they'd be nice to me. Thanks to both of you, Dara Lind and Christina Beltran. Thank you.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.